World War I, which is also known as the Great War and the War to End All Wars, occurred during the 4.5 year period from August 1914 to November of 1918. While the majority of the fighting in the war was done by Europeans, the United States would eventually enter the war in April of 1917. Over the course of the 4.5 years of the war, over 20 million soldiers and civilians would lose their lives. In addition, 20 million soldiers and civilians would be injured as a result of the fighting in the war. And by the time the war was over, the map and the landscape of Europe would be fundamentally changed. As you can see by comparing the two pictures on this slide, the boundaries and borders of countries would change, new countries would be created, and many old countries were erased from the map or broken up to create smaller countries in an effort to prevent a second world war or future conflict between the nations of Europe. While World War I occurred over a relatively short 4.5 year period, the causes of the war had been brewing for over 35 years during the period from 1880 to 1914. During this time, European countries engaged in a series of actions which would increase conflict and rivalry between the nations of Europe and ultimately combine to cause World War I. The development of ideas and political philosophies such as nationalism, imperialism, and militarism, as well as the creation of alliances between European nations, would ultimately come together to disrupt an era of peace that had existed in Europe during the 1800s and cause World War I to begin. The long-term causes of World War I include the four ideas of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the creation of alliances. The first of these problems was nationalism, which can be defined as a love of one's nation or pride in one's country, and a devotion to one's culture, language, and customs. During the period from 1880 to 1914, European nations developed strong senses of nationalism, and many of the nations and their peoples developed the belief that their country, language, and culture were superior to the other nations of Europe. This often led to calls for freedom and self-government or self-determination by the peoples of Europe, and led to a number of small revolutions in the southeastern region of Europe known as the Balkans during the period from 1912 to 1913. These small conflicts would come to be called the Balkan Wars and would play an important role in the events leading up to World War I. Ultimately, the creation of nationalism led to resentment among European nations, where the countries and populations of Europe began to dislike each other and create rivalries and conflicts as a result of the taking of land and territory that was occurring, and the anger that developed as a result of the interactions between nations. Ultimately, this would lead nations to make preparations to prepare for war, further increasing the tension between countries. The second major cause of World War I was the idea of imperialism, which was the effort by a country to expand its economic and political control over other areas of the world. During the period from 1880 to 1914, European countries competed to colonize the areas of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. The countries of Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Russia all competed to claim land and establish colonies throughout these areas of the world. Each country had different goals in this process. Germany, for example, wanted to create naval bases and establish warm water ports so that it would be easier for them to move their navy throughout the world. Other nations were looking to create new markets and gain access to raw materials so that they could create and sell more goods and increase the overall economic power of their country. This competition for colonies often led to war or other conflicts in places outside of Europe, where European nations were competing. These conflicts increased the tension that existed between these countries as a result of several historical problems that had developed before the 1880s. The first of these historical rivalries was the competition that existed between France and Germany over the control of the region of Europe known as Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine is the red region pictured on the map, which exists along the border between France and Germany. This area includes the Rhine River and an area of Europe that includes a number of coal and iron resources which were important to both France and Germany during the Industrial Revolution. In addition to the rivalry between France and Germany, Russia and Austria-Hungary had also developed an alliance because Austria-Hungary was claiming several parts of land in Europe which had existed and included populations known as the Slavic people. The Slavic people were people who had a culture and religion that was similar to that of Russia, and Russia had pledged to protect these nations from colonization or imperialism by Austria-Hungary. The last major conflict that developed and that was exacerbated by colonization was the rivalry between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, which had resulted in the land known as Poland being divided between those three countries. These three historical rivalries were the basis for several of the conflicts and alliances that would ultimately be created leading up to World War I. As a result of imperialism and the competition for colonies, nations of Europe began to practice the idea of militarism, which is a policy of attempting to build up your nation's armed forces to prepare for war. This included spending large amounts of money and resources to increase the size of a nation's army and navy, as well as investments in new weapons, which would play a major role in the fighting of World War I. Militarism was designed to promote a nation's national security and allow each country to protect its colonies and economic interests, which had been developed overseas as a result of imperialism. As militarism improved and increased throughout Europe, England developed the world's strongest navy and was able to sail its ships throughout the world, gaining access to resources and trade throughout Africa and its new colonies. In response to England's development of its navy, Germany focused its efforts on building up and training its military. And by the time World War I began, Germany had developed the strongest and most well-trained military in Europe. They also made efforts to increase the size and strength of their navy in order to compete with England. Ultimately, Germany's decision that was known as the Schlieffen Plan, a military strategy to attack France by going through Belgium, as you can see in the map in the bottom right-hand corner, would be one of the most important events in the escalation of World War I. The rivalries and competition that developed between European nations as a result of militarism ultimately led to the fourth and final cause of World War I, which was the development of alliances and the dividing of the nations of Europe into the two sides of World War I. During the early 1900s, the nations of Europe began to create a system of alliances, hoping to establish a balance of power among the nations of Europe. These alliances developed as nations grouped together, hoping to increase their ability to protect one another from invasion or attack by another country. Alliances were designed to protect and provide security to the nations of Europe because each nation promised to protect and defend its allies if another country attacked them. Alliances were developed and countries joined, attempting to keep the strength of rival nations equal throughout Europe. As you can see in the map or in the diagram up here in the right-hand corner, several countries joined together to create an alliance known as the Triple Alliance. Several other countries joined together to create an alliance known as the Triple Entente. And then there were other countries in the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire who would ultimately be brought into these two major alliances. What ultimately happened because of these alliances is that when an incident occurred involving one member of an alliance, it impacted the other countries who were connected to it because of their pledge to help and defend their allies. The system of alliance ultimately meant that if two European powers went to war, all of the nations would end up being drawn into the conflict. While this was done in an effort to prevent war, it ultimately led to the escalation of the war and the increase in the number of countries involved, which led to the significant casualty numbers and death rates as a result of the war. So while alliances were created in an effort to prevent war, they actually ended up escalating the situation, making World War I significantly more deadly than it might have otherwise been. Ultimately, the alliances that were created leading up to World War I helped to shape and divide the nations of Europe once the war began. Leading up to the war, the Triple Alliance, which had included the nations of Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, would change and become the Central Powers. Italy would leave this alliance and join the Triple Entente, changing sides right before the start of the war. However, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria would join Germany and Austria-Hungary to create the World War I alliance known as the Central Powers. The Central Powers are easily identified on the map of Europe as these red nations which cut right through the center of Europe, starting with Germany in north-central Europe, Austria-Hungary, its neighbor and ally to the south, Bulgaria, down here in the Balkans, and then ultimately the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. These nations formed the strongest alliance in World War I. While the Triple Alliance evolved to become the Central Powers, the Triple Entente, which was the alliance between Russia, England, and France, ultimately expanded to include several other countries. Russia, England, and France would join with Italy, Belgium, and eventually the United States to create the Allied powers. This alliance allowed the Allies to attack and fight the Central Powers on two fronts: the Western Front, which would be the border between France and Germany, and the Eastern Front, which would be the border between Russia and Germany and Austria. This led to the development of the Schlieffen Plan, the German decision to invade France by going through Belgium, and ultimately a two-front war where the Central Powers were fighting on both sides of their country. The ideas and events of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the creation of alliances ultimately set the stage for World War I. However, it would take one event to bring all four of these trends together and ultimately start World War I. This event would occur in the area known as the Balkans, which was in southeastern Europe and included the lands and territories of Greece, Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, and the Ottoman Empire. As a result of nationalism in these areas, the territories of Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, and Greece all fought small conflicts hoping to gain their independence during the Balkan Wars from 1912 to 1913. These conflicts ultimately created hostility between the Slavic nationalities of Serbia, Croatia, Greece, and Albania, and Austria-Hungary, who was attempting to hold on to these territories and keep them as part of their empire. When Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is just to the south of Austria-Hungary, this created an anger among Slavic nationalists in the area who hoped to join with Serbia and create their own country by gaining independence. These nationalists would ultimately carry out the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand when he visited the city of Sarajevo in 1914. Franz Ferdinand's assassination is ultimately known today as the spark that ignited the Balkan powder keg and began World War I. After the assassination, Austria would declare war on Serbia. Serbia would seek out its ally Russia, who had pledged to defend the Slavic nations, and ultimately the alliances of the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente would draw in the other countries, leading to the creation of the Central Powers and the Allied Powers, and the escalation of World War I into a global conflict.